really pleased to hand over to Geoff Belknap and Alex Fitzpatrick from the National Museum of Scotland, who are going to be talking about unlocking the future of virtual volunteering. So over to you, Geoff and Alex.
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome as you come in. Sorry if I look to the right to see who's on the screen versus who's on the presentation. My name is Geoff. I'm here with my colleague Alex, and we're going to talk you through. So the point of this session is to talk through a series of tools that we have developed on a project called the Communities and Crowds Research Project, which is an AHRC-funded project that looks at bridging the gap between in-person volunteering and online volunteering. So what we'll do is we'll talk through our experiences of working with a set of volunteers over the last 2 years, building this kind of new project for volunteer-led digitization. We were originally going to have one of our volunteers, Maureen, join us. Unfortunately, she's had an emergency that's taken her away. So we'll hear from her through a recording, and then we'll have an opportunity to talk and open up the conversation to everyone. So a little bit of information. This project that we're going to talk about is called Communities and Crowds. And it looks at the role of volunteers working with collections to create digital assets and then creating a citizen science through the Zooniverse platform, which is one of the largest or the largest online citizen science platform in the world. It is an AHRC-funded project. It's ran between 2021 and is about to finish it next year. Although the tools that we've created, we're very much hoping to be able to reiterate and change, adapt. So if this sounds like something that you could use for either your own institution or your own practice, then we're very keen to hear more from you to talk about how one might apply the kind of principles that we've developed over the last year. I am currently at the National Museum of Scotland, and I will talk briefly about the project or the version of the project that we're applying to the National Museum of Scotland. But most of this project has been dedicated to the National Science and Media Museum, which is in Bradford, working with one of its largest photographic collections, which I'll talk about very briefly, and a set of 4 volunteers who have worked over a period of about 14 months, creating some amazing digital stories, some digital assets, and a really fantastic Zooniverse project out of it. So the project started with a set of questions. Those questions were, how do we bridge the gap between in-person volunteering and online volunteering? So we know that institutions are typically very good at bringing in volunteers to work with collections objects. I think it's great to hear more throughout today and tomorrow about how we can reach deeper and broader audiences through the kind of core work of bringing volunteers into museums. But in a general sense, museums and institutions, GLAM institutions, are fairly good at the work of bringing people into those collections. The question of the project, though, was what happens if we create a whole life cycle where volunteers not just come in to work with the collections, but by working with those collections, they are then able to not just create the digital assets that they want to work with or that they are working with, but they actually use the digital assets that they create while working with these collections to create a brand new online platform where they can reach a much larger and broader audiences through the collections and the questions that are interesting to them. So ultimately, the core driving question was, how can we open up the archive for our whole communities of volunteers that want to tell their own stories, not just through the collections themselves, but through digital platforms online like Zooniverse. It also started with a very large photographic collection. So this is the 3.5 million or so photographic archive of the mid-20th century newspaper, the Daily Herald. It is very large. It's of something like 3.5 to maybe more than that photographic images representing pretty much everything that someone in the mid-20th century might have been interested in a newspaper archive. We were just very briefly, the project has focused on photographic images from the Daily Herald. So these are really rich objects with great metadata both on the front and the back of the image. And I'll talk very briefly at the end. That project has taken up the kind of large scope of what we've been doing over the last year and a half. But we are also looking to iterate the tools that we've built and the technologies, the sets of volunteers to different collections. So this is a project that I'm currently working with the National Museum of Scotland to look at the stereo images with another group of 4 volunteers, where they're working on a large stereographic collection, which is early 3D technologies, to look at photographs from great exhibitions in the 19th century. More on that shortly. So what is it that we have been doing with the volunteers? Well, we have started by selecting a group of 4 volunteers from the local Bradford community. So as I said before, this archive sits in Bradford. It represents all of the UK, and really it represents global stories. So it is the Daily Herald newspaper is was for a period of time the largest national newspaper in the UK. So it represents all stories that might have been interesting to readers of British newspapers in the mid-20th century. So it has a whole range of stories. So when we first developed the call out to volunteers in Bradford to work with this collection, we wanted to work with anyone, any group of communities who might be interested in telling their own story. So we did a broad call out through our kind of volunteer advertisement, and we ended up getting fairly quickly some really specific interest from a local group of volunteers that were from the Bradford Afro-Caribbean community. So we started working with them, and they were we worked through the archive with them to see what was interesting for them. The archive is really interestingly organized. It is structured very specifically in the way that a newspaper editor would have wanted visual information. So you can find information on geography. There's a whole index on geography. There's a whole index on people. So you can find, from Hitler to Stalin to anyone else in the mid-20th century. And then there's a thematic section. So if you want to find out about fashion, or if you want to find out about other issues which might have been published in the mid-20th century, then you can find those sections. So we worked with the volunteers to go through all of those to figure out what they were most interested in. And what they were most interested in were stories from the West Indies, particularly around island countries such as Jamaica or Cuba or Haiti, and digitizing the folders that had content within those. And they were also particularly interested in shifting experiences over time, and particularly shifting representation of the people represented in West Indian countries through somewhat problematic language that was also represented in this archive. We can also talk briefly towards the end, if you're interested, about how we created a safe space for our volunteers and for our volunteer supervisors around working with content that was both difficult and somewhat problematic, but that's more for later if you're interested. We wanted the volunteers to follow their own, we call desire lines, so that they could digitize this content and then be able to ultimately create a Zooniverse platform out of that content for a much broader and wider public. We worked with 4 amazing volunteers, and I wish all of them could be here to share their own experiences today, but I want to center them now. They are Lincoln Anderson, Maureen Rowe, Sandra Rowe, and Rebecca Smith. All of them had different links and experiences of working with the museum. So some had already worked with us on projects in the past. Rebecca, for example, had been a PhD student working with and on the Daily Herald archive already. And Sandra, Maureen, and Lincoln had worked on a number of other kind of public output exhibition projects with us, as well as volunteer projects within the past. They were all also very enmeshed within the local Bradford communities, particularly Lincoln, Maureen, and Sandra, who were very active parts of the Afro-Caribbean community in Bradford. So they came and worked with us over a period of about 14 months. And they did a whole range of work with us. They documented and digitized the collection. You can see that here. We created working with the Science Museum Group's collection services team, we created a volunteer-led digitization process by which they used a flatbed scanner to digitize the front and the backs of these images. They also rehoused and recatalogued all of these using kind of platform in between our collections management system and not necessarily being an Excel sheet called AppSheet, which we can also talk about later, that allowed them to create really robust digital assets that they could then use to create their citizen science platform, which we will talk about in a moment. These are the kinds of digital assets that they created, and I want to share, let me just check I can share my sound. They created these digital assets, and these are the stories that they tell about them. So let me just play this now. Let me just check that this works. This is Maureen talking about this image and the image that she digitized here.
Hello, my name's Lynn Ray. I'm here at the Insight Archive. Why she's found it interesting today.
Okay. There's a picture that when we were going through it,
Can I just check by hands of thumbs up? Can anyone hear the sound there? You can all hear the sound. Super brilliant. Okay, I will continue playing.
It just popped out. It sort of speaks to me, and it's a black woman. This picture was taken on the 26th of April 1968, and there's a black woman, very very elegantly head wrapped, walking the gauntlet. And this was, she was passing St. Stephen's Church outside the House of Commons, and outside there were porters from Spitalfield Market demonstrating in support of Enoch Powell. Now, when we think about back in the 60s and all the immigration, changes and everything about Enoch Powell, River of Blood, this woman is walking. There's lots and lots of white men, but in all of that, there's the police as well. And for her to walk past that demonstration must have been powerful. She must have been a very, very strong woman in her self-belief, the way she carried herself. She didn't look like she was struggling, and she just walked. And for me, it just says everything about standing up for who you are, speaking out. And when I look at it, I think, yes, but always things change. And I think some things have changed, but we're still demonstrating. We are still fighting to be heard, to be seen. And so for me, yeah, that's it. Every time I look at this picture, every time I see it, I just see this one strong black woman standing up for the community.
So that's Maureen speaking there, really powerful words about what these images have meant to her in particular as she's working with them. So I'm going to pass over now to Alex, who's going to talk you through the process that we worked on.
Yeah, so our process for digitizing the kind of selected Daily Herald archive materials involved weekly in-person volunteering sessions, which were held at the National Science Media Museum here in Bradford. So every Thursday afternoon, our volunteers would come in and they would work on inventorying and rehousing the selected materials into new folders. This also involved in providing these materials with barcode numbers, and all this information, as well as additional collected metadata, such as like photographer names and photo agency names, would be entered into a bespoke app sheet, which is a platform developed by Google, which could be used to kind of build these apps, which was designed specifically for the project. Along this data entry work, our volunteers would also scan the archival materials and undertake post-production editing to ensure that these digitized iterations met the in-house guidelines for the Science Museum Group. So what was particularly unique for this volunteering project was that we also asked volunteers to flag any sensitive content or problematic language found in the archival materials in the app sheet as well. Next slide, please. Because we were working with such potentially sensitive and traumatic material relating to racism and colonialism, along with members of the African Caribbean diaspora, one of the original researchers, Lynn Ray, had ensured to design the in-person workflows to really prioritize the volunteers' well-being and really support that. So the resulting workflow design, which is shown in this diagram, really embedded points of reflection and conversation throughout the day, allowing for volunteers to check in with themselves and also with members of staff and ensure that they continue to feel emotionally prepared for working with the selected material. Instituting a refreshment break really helped break up the afternoon as well and provide some time and space to relax outside of the collections workspace. These breaks are actually really valuable, not only as a means of kind of self-care, but also for the social component that it facilitated. You know, we had all these conversations happening while they were working on specific photographs and documents, and they would often be carried on into these breaks as well. Next slide. So the volunteer-led approach that's always been at the heart of this project did obviously continue into the planning and development of the Zooniverse phase, with our project team supporting the volunteers in designing the online platform to suit their ambitions for the materials that they had curated. This part of volunteering would eventually transition into online sessions, not just because we were working with a very digital part of the project, but also in response to the closure of the National Science and Media Museum for renovation. So developing the Zooniverse project was definitely easier said than done. There was certainly some difficulty in figuring out the best way to plan for a platform that the volunteers, and to be honest, myself as well, didn't have extensive experience with, especially compared to the amount of time we had just spent on the more hands-on in-person work with the archival materials. Next slide. So to kind of help with visualizing an ideal iteration of Zooniverse that would work best with the project that the volunteers had since developed, we started to hold these exploratory sessions with the volunteers, encouraging to have them, explore other Zooniverse projects to get inspiration for their own, as well as discussion sessions, which had been used to kind of identify the volunteers' own goals for this stage of the project. So discussions held after these exploratory sessions really helped volunteers make their intentions more clear and explicit, which you can see in this following chart that we kind of worked on together. So the volunteers were able to identify exactly what they wanted to do with Zooniverse, so capture reactions to photos, exchange knowledge with others around the world, investigate how others related to the photographs, collect both information about the photos as well as the experience of working with them, explore what people see versus what they feel, and increase the accessibility of the archives to others. And they also were able to identify exactly how they wanted to accomplish these things. So through the talk function, which is a function on Zooniverse that allows for conversation between volunteers, and through just transcription, description based tasks, and finally allow them to identify the specific questions they were looking to be answered through Zooniverse. So kind of what information could be gathered from these photographs, how we could combine knowledge gathered from transcribing with external knowledge and experience to develop kind of the wider context of these photographs, and what impact can archival materials have on an emotional state of someone working on them. So through these sessions, we were able to highlight that the volunteers were clearly very keen on the engagement and dialogue potential of Zooniverse and the ways in which this correlated with a broader goal of increasing the accessibility of Daily Herald Archive to the wider community. So by drawing from their own experiences, working in the archives, volunteers were able to identify these goals and these questions, mostly focused on capturing experience and knowledge obtained from working with their selected photographs. Next slide. So the volunteers did struggle a bit with deciding on the sort of tasks that they wanted to set for the digital volunteers on Zooniverse. Part of this was due to the difficulty in visualizing the resulting Zooniverse project, especially when, again, none of the volunteers had really worked with the platform before. And, they'd just spent most of their time on the project working in person on digitizing archival materials. This was a very different phase of work. But despite this lack of prior knowledge about Zooniverse, there was still a lot of excitement regarding this phase of the project and its potential impact on expanding visibility of the curated archival materials. So with this in mind, we eventually began to shift our sessions to focus on more in-depth conversations about Zooniverse as a tool of engagement, resulting in this kind of diagram that me and the volunteers co-created to kind of help clarify the role of Zooniverse in the project. So here we see that the resulting Zooniverse project and its core workflows of transcribing and classifying for the purposes of increasing accessibility and searchability is set into this larger context of potential work occurring outside of the digital parameters, but clearly influenced and informed by Zooniverse. Again, this is represented by that talk function. which we had hoped would create kind of engagement with others invested in the themes of the project, as well as create connections for future collaboration and identify areas for further research. We also brainstormed some of the exciting future work that we might inspire, including, future research on topics and subjects from the archives, additional engagement and learning activities, and just kind of general approaches to expanding the reach of the archives. So by visualizing Zooniverse as a means of expanding access to the Daily Herald archive and acting as a stepping stone for further work outside of the Communities and Crowds project, the volunteers were able to kind of narrow down some of their research questions and determine which sort of tasks would best suit those inquiries. As our volunteers are active members of the local community, I believe that this was actually a really important step for them in kind of developing this project. A reoccurring theme in our conversations was always about how the project overall had been part of, this ambition for a broader impact of this kind of work, and the ways in which we refrain from becoming too insular or closed off from others outside the museum space. Next slide. So to kind of continue this line of deep reflective and speculative work to determine those specific workflows we needed to answer the sort of questions they wanted to ask, the volunteers were also part of what we called a paper prototype session. So here we simulated the experience of a Zooniverse volunteer by using some of the previously selected materials from the archive. So volunteers were basically asked to approach these materials as though it was their first time seeing them, and to basically act out some of the proposed tasks. So transcribing the text that was found in the back of the photographs, classifying each photograph based on the subject and location. We also talked about what sort of reactions people might be having or questions people might be having while doing this work, and what they might want to research further. So in this example, I've kind of shown on this slide to simulate their simulation. These sort of questions revolved around the subject of the image. So, who was that nurse? What was she doing in the image? Their historical context is captured on the back of the photograph. So, what was it like to be a nurse back then? What was her experience moving from Jamaica to the UK? And their actual use in the photojournalism at the time. So, what was this photo used for? What story does it tell? So, after we did these sessions, we would discuss what sort of information we were able to gain through these tasks, and how this new information not only enhance the archival materials, but also connected to some of their previously identified goals and questions. So in these kind of follow-up sessions, we were able to narrow down to 2 tasks. So transcribing the text found on the back of the photographs, and classifying these materials based on subject matter. And then we also identified 6 related research questions. So what are these images supposed to depict in the eyes of the photographer? How does that compare to what the viewer sees? What do these representations reflect as far as the realities faced by community members at the time? What communities and stories are being represented, and how do we best describe them? Next slide, please. So now that we kind of had the general framework of the project, we needed to start designing specific elements such as the look of the web pages and the text. Again, it was vital to ensure that the Zooniverse project not only reflected the goals and objectives of the volunteers, but echoed their voice as well. So we had a master's student doing a placement with us as well, and helped us to work on the Zooniverse build. And the volunteers were asked to kind of describe the project and what they had felt was the most important elements of the research that should be highlighted in the descriptive text that would be located throughout the Zooniverse page. We also asked the volunteers to think about the best advice on working with the archival materials that they could provide to a new volunteer joining the project. And this would also inform the development of the workflow and tutorial text. So our placement student used this information, transcribed from these discussions, and translated them into text that would be refined or revised by volunteers over several sessions, resulting in the text that you see on this slide. Next page. So volunteers were also able to decide on the general design of the Zooniverse page, choosing images from the digitized selection that they felt best represented the ideals of the project. So as you can see on the left side of the current slide, this included, selecting photographs to represent the project as its online avatar. And this may seem like a small set of decisions, but it did force the volunteers to really think about the themes of the project and how they were best encapsulated visually. And it led to a lot of really good conversations on what particular images really, what they felt best represented, what they were trying to convey with the project. The Zooniverse development process was, in general, a really interesting time of reflection for the volunteers. It really required them to think back to the start of their involvement in the project and use their experience learning how to navigate the archives to inform the sort of support we would give to new volunteers to Zooniverse. So, for example, Zooniverse allows for the creation of field guides, which can provide more in-depth explanations for certain elements that the volunteers will encounter while participating. So as you can see on the right side of this slide, our volunteers specifically asked for guides to be created around things that they themselves found particularly confusing or important to understand when they first started working with the Daily Herald archives, including how to identify edit marks and differentiate between stamps belonging to various photographers and picture agencies. So this all kind of led into this development. Next slide. So another theme that we returned to in developing the Zooniverse project was that of the sensitive and problematic content. As I previously discussed earlier in this talk, this was a really important element of designing the original workflows for selecting and digitizing the archival materials. And the volunteers felt it was really important to carry this over into the design of the Zooniverse project. The volunteers were able to collaborate on content warning texts in various iterations on the page, which are shown in this slide, that they felt would best reflect the few images within the curated materials that they themselves are already identified as having potentially upsetting content, while also making clear that this content is still important to have record of as part of their shared history. We were also able to use some of the resources initially gathered for the start of the project to support the volunteers in encountering upsetting content as part of a field guide chapter, again, really bringing the project full circle in a way. Next slide. So to kind of wrap this part of the session up, the resulting Zooniverse project, How Did We Get Here, was officially launched on the 25th of July this year, with 410 photographs and documents digitally available for Zooniverse volunteers from around the world to transcribe and categorize. So because we had a really small subject set, we decided to take a more grassroots word-of-mouth approach to publicity, assuming that, you know, if we didn't really spread the word through our usual channels, it would still take about a month for the volunteers to finish. Now, we didn't anticipate the level of interest and passion that was generated. The project was completed within a week with 211 volunteers collaborating on the project from around the world. And I want to reiterate how fast this was by saying that each item requires a consensus to be retired from volunteer work, meaning that 410 photographs would be needed to complete it around 3 times before being viewed as finished. So a lot of work was done extremely fast. So due to the speed of completion, we weren't able to really truly explore the digital dimension of engaging with archival materials online, nor were we able to really experiment with building an online community. However, we still saw the impact of working closely with these photographs on online volunteers. Using the talk function, we were able to see that many people took it upon themselves to do further research on some of the communities and events depicted in images, something we didn't ask for. And in one instance, we were really moved to see comments from online volunteers reacting really strongly to these harrowing stories of immigration and marginalization illustrated in this collection. So it was really great to still see that, despite how fast it went. So I'm going to pass this back to Geoff to finish off.
Thanks, Alex. So we're going to come briefly to questions and conversation where we could talk about how this might apply to other collections. But I think it's really important to reiterate that while we have talked through a process by which we have created a digitization, a volunteer-led digitization process, and a volunteer-led Zooniverse project, that is just the mechanism. The point of these projects are to create deep level of engagement opportunities for volunteers to really tell their own stories and be the drivers behind what those stories are and why they matter. So because of that, that's created some, I think, really important legacies out of the work that the volunteers have done. and have gone into, as Alex demonstrated in one of her earlier slides, it wasn't just about the creation of the assets and the Zooniverse project. There was much wider impact, and the volunteers were facilitated to have much wider impact through the images that they were creating. So just very briefly, we are iterating this project on a second set of collections, a very different context, very different type of collections. It is dealing with stereo images, where we are about 3 months into working with a brand new set of volunteers in Scotland who are not from a specific community group. They come from a wide group of ages and interests. Some of them are interested in building up skills. Some of them are interested in developing their own stories or telling their own stories through collections. So as I said before, they're working on a set of stereos particularly related to exhibitions during the 19th century, and the kind of Zooniverse project that they're going to create, hopefully in the kind of late winter, early spring of next year, will be very different in terms of its content. So watch this space to see what that looks like and what kind of questions, research questions, are asked. But coming back to the Daily Herald work with the 4 volunteers, what was really exciting was that there was a lot of further carry-on impact outside of the Zooniverse project that the volunteers were able to embed themselves within. So because the project was actually embedded in the National Science and Media Museum, one of, I think, the most important legacies is, as Alex mentioned previously, that the museum is actually closed down right now because they're right in the middle of a £6 million gallery refurbishment, where they're telling brand new stories about the relationship between photography, film, television, and sound technologies that are going to be on 2 floors of new galleries. Open right before Bradford becomes the City of Culture in 2025. So big news for the museum itself. But really importantly, the volunteers' work through the Daily Herald archive is actually going to be represented on the galleries in these brand new, what are called the Sound and Vision galleries. And that's not because the museum or the curators built these stories into the workflow or the new gallery development, but it's because the images that the volunteers created are so powerful that they've ended up being incorporated into the new development of the galleries, and will have a really long-lasting legacy. There is also other projects that are ongoing, such as the Science Museum's Congruence Engine project. This is towards a national collection project, which is looking at connecting industrial heritage collections across institutional boundaries between the Science Museum Group and many other science and industry-related museums. And within that, Alex, particularly working on part of that project now, we are looking at how the Communities and Crowds platforms and protocols can be applied to other research projects, and to see if not just the work of the volunteers, but actually the principles that we have developed can be incorporated into other digital humanities projects. And the last thing I'll say is all of this will be published and shared as toolkits, so sets of downloadable workflows that you can apply or utilize for your own collection, because the core consideration for us is to be able to create a set of experiences that are unique to each of our volunteers, but are also applicable and repurposable for different institutions, because we're hoping that this kind of work to really engage a deep level of interaction with the volunteers, both in person and online, is useful for other institutions to be able to reapply to their own, particularly photographic collections. So that will be shared shortly, or at least in the next 6 months, we're hoping. But we are also happy to talk about how that might be applied to other institutional collections. So these are some QR codes if you would like to go to both the Zooniverse project. There is also a really interesting thing called the Community Catalog, which is technical infrastructure that we have built as part of the Zooniverse platform. The last thing to say is, I should have mentioned this before, this is a project in collaboration directly with the Zooniverse. So one of our colleagues, Samantha Blicken, who's the co-primary investigator, can't be here today, but she is currently the co-director of Zooniverse, the Adler Planetarium, and has worked to co-develop this whole project with us. I will finish there, and I will open up. I know there's a bunch of chat here, so let me stop sharing, and we will open it up to conversation. Bear with me a second. I will open up the chat and see what people have been saying. Second, great. So We have a number of questions coming through. Let me just go from the top. Let's see if we have any. Feel free to jump in with your voice, your mic, if you would, if you'd like to ask any direct questions. Question about the stereo collection. Brian May is a massive stereo collector, and we've been talking to and working with his curator, Denis Pellerin, as part of this. Yeah, I have a question there. Fionn?
Hiya. I was wondering if you could discuss more the sort of logistics and the operation. So how much funding did you get? How did you spend that funding? Did you employ staff? Do you have to buy equipment, etc., if that's possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So the research, so it's funded as a research project. So it was, the most of the funding went to staffing for the postdocs. Alex was one of them. There was another postdoc named Lynn Ray. So the full funding was £250,000 over 3 years. That was to deliver the research process. So Alex and Lynn were funded as the primary research postdocs, as well as time buyouts for the primary investigators, both myself and Samantha Blicken, to deliver on the actual project itself and to incorporate it into the museum, which meant that the research postdocs were embedded in the National Science and Media Museum and were the volunteer supervisors. So their time was also the staff time to deliver the volunteer workflows. There were other small amounts of staff non-staff costs, such as buying a flatbed scanner. So that cost in total about £2,000. It depends on whether you incorporate the licenses for things like Adobe Creative Bridge and the Adobe Suites. But it was fairly affordable in terms of cost. So we tried to keep the actual direct costs for doing this work as minimal as possible. So really it was the digitization scanners themselves that cost the most amount of money to actually deliver on this project. The other bit of money that would cost the most is staff time, and whether or not you have space to free up staff time to do one volunteering session every week. I guess the most important thing was creating a consistent volunteering experience, so that there was a dedicated member of staff delivering on this on a weekly basis for an afternoon. We were lucky in that the postdoc was able to deliver that. I was also the head curator at the National Science and Media Museum, managing both the postdoc and the curatorial team at that time, so was able to free up some other members of staff if there was needing for backfill, if and when that needed to happen. But really was, in terms of cost, fairly minimal. The other tools, such as the app sheet, which we talked very briefly about, which was the documentation tool, was free and open source. We'll be able to share that as well more widely if anyone's interested in that. And then the digitization workflow as well. We used other internal staff time from Science Museum Group to be able to build those. And again, we'll be sharing those protocols so that people can use those more widely. Just going through the chat.
There's a couple of questions asking about training and recruitment for volunteers. So I think some people are asking about the Zooniverse ones, and some are asking for the original core one. So we could probably tackle that.
Sure.
You can speak more to that.
Yeah, sure. So absolutely. The training for the volunteers is, so let's talk about the in-person side of it. We spent about a month and a half to 2 months doing the volunteer recruitment. So we were very, we can talk about how the Science Museum Group generally recruits volunteers. So we use a general kind of a recruitment template, again, which we'll be sharing those templates once we have the toolkit open and communicable. That allowed us to ask for the widest diversity of volunteers. So once we had recruited those volunteers, the training program as well, we will talk through that process in the toolkit, but essentially it was bringing the volunteers and setting up a series of workshops by which they, the first and foremost, it wasn't actually the digitization training that was critical, but the time spent in the archive, because they needed to go through, it is a very large and broad archive. So they needed, we set probably about a month's worth of volunteering sessions where they just wandered through the archive and worked with the postdoc or volunteer supervisor to look at the archive, find out what's interesting to them, to talk about it, reflect on it, and ask questions about it. After they had decided what was most interesting, we then brought in some time from our documentation managers and also our digitization managers within the Science Museum group to walk them through both the digitization and the documentation workflows. We tried to create them as streamlined as possible and without requiring any specific skill sets in either documentation or digitization to be able to do the work. So they are hopefully fairly straightforward. I think it's important to say the volunteers didn't love the digitization part of it. So Alex did pick up some, and Lynn did pick up some of that actual digitization work. The documentation was a bit easier. We did use barcoding. One doesn't have to use barcoding, but that was the process that we used. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later, but I see there's some more questions. Chris, you have your hand up?
Oh yeah. I mean, thank you both. It's what a fascinating project. I just wondered your thoughts in terms of how this, or how or whether this could be scaled up going forward. It seems obviously there are some constraints, not least the staff investment of time and the volunteer experience being paramount. But what are the opportunities now? You've done it once, you're starting on your second time. What are the opportunities to involve more volunteers and do more projects perhaps simultaneously, or maybe partnerships with other organizations along the way?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And it goes back to one of the other questions just right at the end of that Steph asked about whether more than 4 volunteers applied. I think the really important outcome of this is that the key aspect of this is about deep level of engagement with a manageable group of people. So I think the number of volunteers, actually, we wouldn't want to scale. We could, depending on the large size of the institution, do a number of different concurrent volunteer projects, as long as there was enough staff time to be able to deliver on those projects. But I think a coherent, small, and community-focused group is really important to build. So we brought in 4 volunteers to a certain degree because we were delivering this project during COVID. So there were certain limitations on the number of people that could actually be in the archives working with the collection. But we also found that 4 volunteers was a good, stable amount of people to come in every week, a consistent group of people. Again, we were putting no demands or requirements that they had to come in. This wasn't a job. So, it was all through their own free will and desire to work on these collections. So having a really strong community aspect of it was key to us. And they were able to deliver on a set of digitized assets over a period of time because they were consistent and they came back in over and over again. In terms of scaling it up, I think what we're really keen on is seeing if other institutions can pick up this kind of workflow to work with their own collections. And again, the key point is this isn't about getting your digital assets up and online. This isn't about trying to get as many, we worked with volunteers over a 14-month period and it got about 500 images. So if you're looking for a project to get images online or on your platform, this isn't the project, right? What this project is for a deep level of engagement with your audiences to tell their own stories through the digital assets and then create a citizen science platform online. The citizen science platform, I think, is the opportunity to really scale, and we're hoping through the next iteration of the project to be able to expand and do more online, have more time online for volunteers to work with it. So but working with partners, anyone that's interested in hearing or talking or working with us or working with this project before it becomes a toolkit, then we're very happy. We'll put our email, Alex, if you can put our emails in the chat, then that would be great. There's a couple more questions. For the second iteration, how do you recruit volunteers? It was a very similar recruitment process at the National Museum of Scotland. So we used pretty much the same template that we used in Bradford, but we applied it to the brand of NMS. And we recruited around to interested volunteers. We actually ended up recruiting a set of people who had already expressed interest in volunteering to the National Museum of Scotland. So it wasn't from a community group, but it was people that just wanted to volunteer with NMS working with collections. And that's who we're working with now. So part of that is to see if a different identity group of volunteers will create a different level of engagement. So I don't have any answer for that yet, but so far they are very engaged with the stereos that they're working on. If you're interested in following that on more, we both talk about this on our social media. I'm Curator Geoff on Twitter, as well as my other, and Alex, if you want to stick in your social media for as well in the chat. You can follow along there. You can also follow along the Science Museum Group's website has our Communities in Crowds research project, where we'll be publishing more about this. We've got a couple minutes left, and I don't want to break into the coffee break. Are there any other questions anyone wants to ask, or anything that any burning?
A couple of questions about Zooniverse. So just to say that the way we got people onto Zooniverse, like I said, was a very grassroots approach. We didn't put any big comms out from the National Science Museum or the Science Museum Group. Zooniverse itself has its own community of volunteers that really kind of work on any project. So I think a lot of the people who were not really Bradford based came from that. But I also know that because our volunteers themselves are very connected within the community, as well as kind of outside the community as well. I know they spread the word to friends, family members from, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. So it was a very word of mouth kind of process. It wasn't necessarily targeted per se. But it makes the speed of completion even more amazing, because we really just had no idea that it was going to be that fast. As far as training, it was all kind of tutorial based. Zooniverse is a great platform for that kind of work, where everything's very much kind of streamlined, and you just kind of develop these tutorials so that people can learn as they go. So there wasn't necessarily any advanced training needed for that aspect.
I should also say the Zooniverse has its own product. So we worked with Zooniverse themselves, but they also have what's called the Project Builder, which allows any person to build a project and to add their own data into the project. And because of that, they also have an online community of about 2.6 million registered users on their website. So they're a gigantic community of users. Obviously, not all 2.6 will come to any one project, but they're a ready-made community of people. And then I just saw there was a question about if some weren't keen on doing the scanning, to be explore different group to do that aspect. No, actually, we didn't. And part of that reason was because we wanted this to be a kind of contained project. We didn't want other volunteers to come in and do a week. That could be another way in which we do it in the future. But for this project, because we were working as a team, both with the volunteer supervisor and the volunteers, we wanted to essentially share labor. So if the volunteers didn't want to do something, then we would pick that up and work with them to be able to figure out how to deliver on the project. Because ultimately, this is about co-creation, about working together to co-create something together, both institutional and volunteer-led. I think we're about at the end of our time. So thank you all so much for your time today. If you want to hear more, talk to us. You have our contact emails and content there. And you can always ask us on email or on social media if you have any more questions, or if you want to hear more about how you could do this with your own collection.